I wanted to ask, am I on?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Nancy, basically, I'm Susan Levine, a clinician, with all the information that we have here, and granted that the field is still quite murky, in terms of just when a patient with CFS symptoms comes to a doctor's office, would you recommend, with the state of the art the way it is today, which of the T-cell markers from your laboratory should be ordered? Should we include the neuropeptide, for instance? Do you recommend that the average clinician administer a scale to determine how severely can you give some examples of where some of your basic research findings can be useful in a clinical practice setting and would be a reasonable thing to do, maybe at a baseline and then perhaps a year later? Are any of those things useful?
Well, and you're an immunologist too, immunology trained as I am, and so I think we're more prone to use immunologic bioassays in our clinical practices. I mean, rule of thumb has always been not to order things you don't intend to act on or aren't going to give you a reasonable piece of information.
That's sort of what I was getting at. It's of interest, yet it's hard to...
So I actually do measure NK cell function, not very frequently, but I measure it at baseline. I'm trying to group my patients into who's more immune viral versus, say, the fibro more central pain group. And so I use that type of assay and the immune activation stuff to try to split. More recently, because we use a multiplex cytokine assay that really is impressively nailing pro-inflammatory cytokine expression, and because IL-17 and IL-23 come from the gut when there's GI inflammatory sources. So, I mean, as a clinician, as an immunologist clinician, I don't know if I'd say this in primary care settings.
Right.
I think I get a pretty good handle on pointing at where the inflammation is with the cytokine expression assays. So, I mean, you could do that. I could do that. I really don't think that a rheumatologist could do that. But I don't know that I would necessarily have a primary care doctor doing that.
Right. And would you find it appropriate to do it like a year later just to check?
If I intervened or if the patient changed, I don't do anything unless there's a change or I'm intending to change my immune-based therapies or whatever. I also measure, don't get all hung up on immunology. I mean, these patients are vitamin D deficient, they're B12 deficient. There's some very common things to go after, and they affect cell function. So I might repeat because I repaired everything I could find to repair, and then I want to see if it made a difference.
And then just one more question on the, I found it interesting because we sort of skip over it, I think, a little bit, the Gulf War patients, which obviously you see a lot. Why would you postulate that they're seemingly worse on some of the lymphocyte transformation things you showed?
I don't think what our data is suggesting right now is that the chronic fatigue patients and the Gulf War patients have very similar pathways that are disrupted. But the Gulf War patients are a lot sicker, believe it or not, a lot sicker at baseline, and they are much more frail with even minor jiggles with exercise or anything else. So as you can see from our immune activation data, they had 711 different genes flying different directions at 4 hours post the exercise. Now you cluster those into groups, it might be 40 that are regulating TNF, for instance. You know, that's not 700 different systems, that's genes. And there's a lot of genes involved in any one protein expression. So they boil down into different pathways, and the pathways in chronic fatigue and Gulf War overlap substantially, but they're not exactly the same. Like the neuropeptide Y observation, they're completely different. They look normal in the Gulf War patients, and yet they're quite abnormal in the chronic fatigue syndrome patients.
Hi, Dane Cook, University of Wisconsin. This is for the entire panel, and it gets back to kind of the science and how you do these trials, or even how you do the basic science, and that's who's the appropriate comparison groups. Who do we compare these things, and then as a follow-up, how do we determine what's regulation versus dysregulation in these systems that we're looking at?
You want to jump that one? Because, I mean, I think it depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at, say, a very deconditioned group, well, first off, like that Gulf War study, they were matched on VO2 max. We very carefully talk about a matched cohort. They were BMI matched, ethnicity matched, VO2 max matched. They were matched in every kind of way. And I think that's about as clean, as pristine a data set as I've ever been able to put together. But that's not easy. And just deconditioning alone is in our original autonomic study with Dr. Hurwitz, conditioning predicted much of the sympathetic dysregulation. And so being deconditioned really mattered. So yeah, it's very tricky. If I originally loved the idea of putting an clean autoimmune group, rheumatoid arthritis, something very clean, single antigen, clean little group over here to look at chronic immune activation through that pathway. And then something like, say, MS. That's a messy group. We don't understand exactly what's going on in MS, really, even to this day. It's as complicated as
this is what I meant when I said before that I have to rely, as the virologist of the team, I have to rely on my colleagues, my clinical colleagues, to give me the best samples they can give me, and then I can go do my stuff. We can't, on our end, really sort of deal with that.
Let me throw in another wrinkle. Menopause. Whoa, big deal. I mean, really affects endocrine and flesh inflammation and everything. This is a group of patients whose mean age is just in the perimenopausal years. And menopause, according to the CDC study, occurs 10 years earlier on average in chronic fatigue syndrome patients than in healthy controls. So menopause is happening in the mid-40s instead of the mid-50s. That's a really big deal, and it's affecting our data sets. So what you have to do for something like that, cycle. When do we draw the blood? Well, we draw the blood within 2 weeks of the last period, so we're always in the same part of the menstrual cycle, if there is a menstrual cycle, and so that we can try to control for that. It is a very difficult thing to work with human beings. It really is.
Yeah.
Men are tricky too. You guys are really weird, because your little testosterone levels matter, and they decline, I'm sorry to say. But so you have to match for things like that.